This demonization was exemplified by the captivity narratives, which became a popular genre in the U.S. These narratives were supposedly first-person narratives of white women who were abducted by savages and forced to undergo untold savagery. Their tales, however, were usually written by white men who had their own agenda. For instance, in 1823, James Seaver of New York interviewed Mary Jemison, who was taken as captive by the Seneca. Jemison chose to remain among them when she was offered her freedom, but Seaver is convinced that she is protecting the Indian people by not describing their full savagery. Quote, "The vices of the Indians she appeared disposed not to aggravate, and seemed to take pride in extolling their virtues. A kind of family pride induced her to withhold whatever would blot the character of her descendants, and perhaps induced her to keep back many things that would have been interesting." End quote. Consequently, he supplements her narrative with material from authentic sources and Jemison's cousin, George. Seaver nonetheless attributes these supplements to her voice in the supposed first-person narrative. In these narratives, we can find what Carol Adams terms as an, quote, absent referent. Adams provides an example by noting how the term battered woman makes women the inherent victims of battering. The batterer is rendered invisible and is thus the absent referent. Another example of an absent referent can be found in the Christian symbol of the crucifixion, in which Jesus is represented as one whose inherent nature and purpose is to be crucified. The individuals who put him on the cross, never depicted in terms of representations of the cross, are erased as the perpetrators, and they become the absent referent. Andrea Dworkin argues that in a patriarchal system, quote, men are distinguished from women by their commitment to do violence rather than to be victimized by it. In adoring violence, from the crucifixion of Christ to the cinematic portrayal of General Patton, men seek to adore themselves. End quote. June Namias argues that the point of these depictions is to instill the belief in white women that they need white men to protect them from savages. Jane Caputi also suggests that in depictions of killing of women, the killer plays alter ego to the male reader or viewer of the killing. Quote, "This convention allows the identifying viewer to gratifyingly fantasize himself in the two mutually reinforcing male roles at once. He is both the protector and the menace." End quote. According to Jane McCrea, the white man both symbolically kills a white woman through the Indians, which mirrors his desires, and rushes to her rescue. The white male is absent when the violence occurs, yet he is the one who has created the image in which the white man is the absent referent. He glorifies his ability to brutalize white women through the Indian savage while denying his culpability. Meanwhile, Native women are completely absent from this picture, and consequently, their actual sexual brutalization at the hands of white men escapes notice. The white man literally brutalizes her while symbolically brutalizing the white woman through this representational practice. Native men are scapegoated for his actions so that white women will see them as the enemy, while white men remain unaccountable. Paula Gunn Allen argues that colonizers realized that in order to subjugate indigenous nations, they would have to subjugate women within these nations. Native peoples needed to learn the value of hierarchy, the role of physical abuse in maintaining that hierarchy, and the importance of women remaining submissive to their men. They had to convince, quote, both men and women that a woman's proper place was under the authority of her husband, and that a man's proper place was under the authority of the priests, end quote. She further argues, quote, "It was to the advantage of white men to mislead white women and themselves into believing that their treatment of women was superior to which they considered savage. Had white women discovered that all women were not mistreated, they might have been intolerant of their men's abusiveness." End quote. Thus, in order to colonize a people whose society was not hierarchical, colonizers must first naturalize hierarchy through instituting patriarchy. Patriarchal gender violence is a process by which colonizers inscribe hierarchy and domination on the bodies of the colonized. Ironically, while enslaving women's bodies, colonizers argue that they were actually somehow freeing Native women from this oppression that they supposedly faced in Native nations. Thomas Jefferson argued that Native women are submitted to unjust drudgery. This, I believe, is the case with every barbarous people. It is civilization alone which replaces women in the enjoyment of their equality. End quote. The Mariposa Gazette similarly noted that when Indian women were safely under the control of white men, they are, quote, neat and tidy and industrious and soon learn to discharge domestic duties properly and creditably. End quote. In 1862, a native man in Corn Row Valley was killed and scalped with his head twisted off, his killer saying, quote, "You will not kill any more women and children," end quote. Apparently, Native women can only be free while under the dominion of white men, and both Native and white women have to be protected from Indian men rather than from white men. A 1985 Virginia Slims ad reflected a similar notion that white patriarchy saves Native women from oppression. On the left side of the ad was a totem pole of cartoonish figures of Indian women. Their names: Princess Wash and Scrub, Little Running Water Fetcher, Keeper of the Teepee, Princess Breakfast, Lunch and Dinner Preparer, Woman Who Gathers Firewood, Princess Buffalo Robe Sewer, Little Woman Who Weaves All Day, and Woman Who Plucks Feathers for Chief's Headdress. The caption on top of the totem pole reads, quote, Virginia Slims remembers one of so many societies where the women stood head and shoulders above the men, end quote. On the right side of the ad is a model adorned with makeup and dressed in a tight skirt, nylon, and high heels with the familiar caption, quote, You've come a long way, baby, end quote. The message is that Native women, oppressed in their tribal societies, need to be liberated into a patriarchal standard of beauty, where their true freedom lies. The historical record suggests, as Paula Gunn Allen argues, the real roots of feminism should be found in Native societies. But in this Virginia Slims ad, feminism is tied to colonial conquest. White women's liberation is founded on the destruction of supposedly patriarchal Native societies. Today we see this discourse utilized in the War on Terror. To justify the bombing of Afghanistan, Laura Bush declared, quote, The fight against terrorism is also a fight for the rights and dignity of women, end quote. These sentiments were shared by mainstream feminists. Eleanor Smeal, former president of the National Organization for Women, NOW, and founder and president of the Fund for a Feminist Majority, said, quote, Without 9/11, we could not get the Afghanistan tragedy in focus enough for the world powers to stop the Taliban's atrocities or to remove the Taliban. Tragically, it took a disaster for them to act definitively enough, end quote. It seems the best way to liberate women is to bomb them. Meanwhile, the Revolutionary Association of Women of Afghanistan, RAWA, whose members were the very women who were to be liberated by the war, denounced it as an imperial venture. Quote, RAWA has in the past repeatedly warned that the U.S. government is no friend of the people of Afghanistan, primarily because during the past 2 decades she did not spare any effort or expense in training and arming the most sordid, the most treacherous, the most misogynistic, and anti-democratic indigenous Islamic fundamentalist gang, and innumerable crazed Arab fanatics in Afghanistan, and in unleashing them upon our people. After the retreat of the Russian aggressors and the collapse of Najib's puppet regime in Afghanistan, these fundamentalist entities became all the more wildly unbridled. They officially and wholeheartedly accepted the yoke of servitude to the interests of foreign governments, in which capacity they have perpetrated such crime and atrocities against the people of Afghanistan that no parallel can be found in the history of any land on earth. RAWA roundly condemns the U.S. airstrikes against Afghanistan because the impoverished masses of Afghanistan, already trapped in the dogfighting between the U.S.'s Taliban and jihadi flunkies, are the ones who are the most hurt in the attacks, and also because the U.S., like the arrogant superpower she is, has violated the sovereignty of the Afghan people and the territorial integrity of the Afghan homeland. The U.S. is against fundamentalist terrorism to the extent and until such time as her proper interests are jeopardized. Otherwise, she is all too happy to be a friend and sponsor of any fundamentalist terrorist criminal entity. If the U.S. does not want her ridiculous bigotry to show and really wants to eliminate fundamentalist terrorism, she should draw lessons from her own past myopic policies and realize that the sources of fundamentalist terrorism are America's support to the most reactionary regimes in Arab and non-Arab countries, and her military and financial largesse to Afghan fundamentalist criminals. Terrorism will be uprooted only when these two sources are dried up. End quote. So why does a group like the Fund for a Feminist Majority ignore the voice of RAWA? Again, even within feminist circles, the colonial logic prevails that women of color, indigenous women, and women from the global south countries are only victims of oppression rather than organizers in their own right. The assimilation into white society, however, only increased Native women's vulnerability to violence. For instance, when the Cherokee Nation was forcibly relocated to Oklahoma during the Trail of Tears in the 19th century, soldiers targeted for sexual violence Cherokee women who spoke English and who had attended mission schools instead of those who had not taken part in these assimilation efforts. They were repeatedly gang raped, causing one missionary to the Cherokee, Daniel Buttrick, to regret that any Cherokee had ever been taught English. Homi Bhabha and Edward Said argue that part of the colonization process involves partially assimilating the colonized in order to establish colonial rule. That is, if the colonized group seems completely different from the colonists, they implicitly challenge the supremacy of colonized rule because they are refusing to adapt to the ways of the colonizers. Hence, the colonizers must seem to partially resemble the colonists in order to reinforce the dominant ideology and establish that the way colonizers live is the only good way to live. However, the colonized group can never be completely assimilated, otherwise they'd be equal to the colonists, and there'd be no reason to colonize them. If we use Baba and Said's analysis, we can see that while Cherokee women were promised that assimilation would provide them with the benefits of dominant society, in fact, assimilation efforts made them more easily subjugated by colonial rule.